Next up is the phosphorus cycle. There's a fair amount of slides here, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here is phosphorus cycle, and looks hopefully somewhat familiar regarding, say, nitrogen or some of the other cycles that we'll deal with, but there's several pieces to this. There's additions, things like fertilizer, for example, plant residue, manure, biosolids that going in. There's this organic fraction, organic form of phosphorus, which includes residues, the microbial biomass, all of the organisms present in the soil, this stable humus. And then, of course, on the left here is the inorganic fraction, so things like clay minerals and secondary minerals, etc., etc. So we're going to get into each one of these pieces. Losses include things like runoff and erosion, a little bit of leaching that occurs with phosphorus, and then, of course, crop removal. Here's another picture. The first picture was from the Haviland textbook. This is from the Brady and Wild Soils textbook. It's the same pieces, but maybe just might just help to kind of look at it in a little bit different function or format. So we can compare and contrast the phosphorus cycle with the nitrogen cycle, and we'll see that the nitrogen cycle being up here that we've already discussed, and the phosphorus cycle we just introduced. And there's some differences. So one of the main differences is that this whole inorganic fraction or inorganic phase that's strongly controlled by adsorption and desorption reactions, or precipitation and dilution reactions. Okay, so that's represented by these boxes here. And notice that in phosphorus, that's not present at all in the nitrogen cycle. We'll see that for phosphorus has much fewer pathways for loss. Okay, so for nitrogen we had leaching, denitrification, volatilization, and here there's also erosion, which didn't even make its way to the chart. Here we just really have erosion and then a small amount of leaching that's possible. There's no gaseous phase in phosphorus, unlike nitrogen. Leaching rates are typically very low for phosphorus compared to nitrogen. Nitrogen, we can get a large amount of total N that's left. It's not uncommon to see 20, 30, maybe 40 kilograms of nitrogen that are lost in nitrate in a fertilized system. But for phosphorus, those would be at least maybe 1 or 2 kgs or something like that. So like an order of magnitude less than we're talking, and maybe even less than that than we're talking with nitrogen. Okay. Another piece that I won't really get into, but details of organic phosphorus cycling is not particularly fully understood, and part of that is because it's very difficult to study phosphorus and organic phosphorus cycling. We don't have methodologically very good tools to do that. For nitrogen, we've got stable isotope forms of nitrogen, which are have become really commonplace to manipulate and study. For phosphorus, it's not. There's no kind of stable isotope form. It's a radioactive isotope, which is much more dangerous to work with and a lot more controlled, and just more expensive as a result. And so part of that, is one of the reasons that we don't have there's still plenty of mystery in terms of nitrogen and the controls of nitrogen cycling in the organic fraction, but for phosphorus, it's even more so. Additions, transformations, losses. Really, we're going to talk not too much about additions. We'll talk about that in a later lecture about peat fertilizer. We don't really spend too much on erosion, leaching, crop removal. We've talked about these with nitrogen. Really what we're going to focus on primarily is this transformation piece and looking at these kind of 3 components here. So that's what we're going to get into now. Phosphorus is complicated. Phosphorus cycling is complicated, and we can create these conceptual diagrams like you're seeing here and talk about solubility or availability being high, medium, low, very low, etc., etc. And we typically will, define these by our methods. They're what we call operationally defined, which means that our method is actually defining what that pool might be. So we might think of solution P, weakly absorbed, strongly absorbed, and then very strongly absorbed. And we might have different successive fractions that would quantify that, right? And that's for phosphorus. There are several fractions that do that. A Headley fraction is one such thing, but we can again classify these things into these nice clean boxes. The reality is that there's a lot of overlap, and we just have to often say, like, okay, so weakly absorbed phosphorus is defined by this extraction method, for example. So that's typically what happens. And we can think about the form of the source of P, the extractability by soil test, and the availability to plants. And so really we've got solution P, and then we've got this weakly absorbed P. Both we would consider those highly available. And then we've got this kind of strongly adsorbed, and then even into the mineral fraction, and then this is like becomes less available. Okay. Now, an important model for phosphorus development and soil development is this was proposed, over 40 years ago by Walker and Sires, and it's this idea of kind of soil weathering and then the form and fraction of phosphorus that occurs. Okay, and so this is again from their original publication, and this is really a percentage of that phosphorus fractionation or phosphorus piece over time. And what they proposed was that soils that were young, relatively recently developed, would have this non-included phosphorus fraction that would be highly available and occupy, if you added all these up, it occupies this P subscript non-included occupies a large percentage of the total phosphorus. As that soil would age over time, this non-included fraction becomes less and less until it basically becomes really hard to measure. And then it's taken over by this occluded phosphorus, and then this organically bound phosphorus is kind of like this constant piece to this whole time series. Okay, so what they hypothesized was that phosphorus availability is greatest for plants when soils are young, and really this diminishes over time. Okay, so an important kind of model if you are studying phosphorus and really kind of getting into some of the science behind it, this is something to be aware of. And there's been great work that's kind of taken this theory and shown it some empirical evidence for it. And I just point out that one of these examples is Hawaii as an archipelago and a set of islands that really sets up a really nice natural experiment as a chronosequence. Okay, if we think back to intro soil or the 5 soil forming factors from Hans Jenny, it's parent material, climate, the type of biology that's there, the topography, and the last one is time, how much weathering has occurred. These 5 things, right? The parent material of where it came from, the climate it's developed under, the types of plants and animals and soil critters that are there, how steep the slope is, and then this time or weathering piece. These things, these 5 pieces, to a large extent, determine what type of soil we have, and that's just kind of a soils 101. You're going to get that in, if you haven't taken an intro soils class, that's one of the first things you talk about in terms of what creates soils and what determines what type of soil we have. Okay. So Hawaii is a really nice example because a lot of these things are controlled for. We have islands that are over 4 million years old, 1.5 million years old, say 150,000 years old, and then even new pieces of that island as this plate has shifted in this kind of volcanic activity, has bubbled up from the surface and formed these islands. We've got soil in Hawaii that's less than 300 years old. So this is like the most recent piece of that island versus the oldest. And in terms of what is in that parent material, the climate, the biology, and the topography, we can really control those, hold those constant, and look at time as our factor that we're manipulating. Okay, so that's a nice model. This has been used for a lot of ecosystem ecology and a lot of biogeochemistry studies. Peter Vatusek at Stanford has made his whole career really kind of studying this as a model, and there's been lots of his students and scientists that have come and looked at different components. So it's a pretty interesting thing to dive into. So soil weathering and P availability. In Hawaii soils, not included biologically, or not included, that is biologically available peaks, the amount of that non-included phosphorus fraction peaks around 10,000 years. Okay, so this is from a study done several decades ago, but very important, highly cited study showing the time from very young to very old, and then looking at quantifying those different phosphorus fractions from calcium-based to organically bound to occluded and non-included. And again, we see around 10,000 years is where this non-included piece really peaks. And interestingly, if you go and you sample foliar phosphorus concentrations, what these authors did, we can see the phosphorus as these open circles, these open squares, nitrogen being these kind of closed diamonds, if you can see that. And it's really around this 10,000 years where we see foliar phosphorus concentration increase. Now these are, of course, tropical forest in Hawaii. These aren't phosphorus fertilized, okay, but it's just looking kind of, if we remove this element of management and remove the element of fertilizer, how much phosphorus is available, and how is that reflected in plants and plant development? And so, this again is kind of seminal work showing that as soils age, phosphorus and the phosphorus availability kind of evolves. It peaks, say around, well, at least in Hawaii at 10,000 years, but sometime in relatively geologic time it peaks. And then that availability starts to decrease over time. And if we think about, the soils that, say, we have here in Ohio, and, might want to compare that to, say, what we find in, say, Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama, the southeast, we have much more recently glaciated soils here. Soils that might be 10,000 years old or 12,000 years old or 8,000 or what have you, versus some in the southeast where they have not seen glaciation, say in the last 100 or more 200,000 years, and so those soils in the southeast are very different. Phosphorus availability is very different as a result. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind in terms of, well, it's all this stuff that we're going to be talking about now. A lot of it is dictated by the age of that soil, and the age of a soil has a lot to do with how it behaves, how it functions, etc. We talked about that early in the semester with isomorphic substitution and negative charges and 1-to-1 versus 2-to-1 clays, and the same is true for thinking through some of these cycles. Okay. So back to our phosphorus cycle, our inorganic fraction here, our solution, and organic. And we're going to start by talking about the solution phosphorus next. Solution phosphorus is a very small fraction of the total phosphorus. And we have labile or available P and then non-labile or not available P. Both the labile and the non-labile represent both inorganic and organic forms of phosphorus. So it's important when we think about availability, we're talking about kind of relative availability, and then we're going to be talking about the inorganic first and then the organic forms of P. There's, in both of those fractions, there's relative the availability of that phosphorus to a plant is relative, from very available to not available at all. Okay. So we talked about in solution P, this orthophosphate. The amount of H2PO4 and HPO4 represented in the soil solution depends on the pH. And when soils are approximately neutral, around 7.2, the H2PO4 and HPO4 are going to be represented in relatively equal proportions. As that pH drops, we can see this general trend of hydrogen ions increasing, and as that pH increases, the hydrogen ions decrease. And so that's a general trend, okay? Solution P, very small amount of phosphorus is actually in solution, and when crops are plucking that orthophosphate out of the solution, we're looking for, from a crop production perspective, we're looking for soils that are able to have a high buffering capacity and resupply that soil phosphorus from either the inorganic or from the organic fraction, okay? Solution phosphorus moves via diffusion. We talked about this already. Diffusion is an important step, and it's moving down that concentration gradient, okay? And so ranges of solution phosphorus can be 0.003, maybe up to 3 part per million. You can see that, that's essentially 3 phosphorus molecules for every, million, say, water molecules. And that's like a very, it's a relatively small amount. And so optimal crop production, this is highly dependent on the time or whatever, but a general rule is, say, from like 0.05 to 0.1 ppm is what we'd ideally like for crop production, okay? So it can range quite a bit, but it's still in a very small concentration in terms of what's in that soil solution. It's important that plants take up this form, and it's important to understand that phosphorus moves very slowly in soil, right? So most phosphorus will move less than 1 inch in the soil to roots, and they must be replenished from other sources. And so here's some diffusion coefficients of nitrate, potassium, and orthophosphate, and here the diffusion rate on a per millimeter per day. So nitrate might move 3 millimeters, potassium 0.9, and then you can see how it drops off with phosphorus. This is just showing the same thing from like a nutrient management perspective, where how much nitrogen, if we ban, say, nitrogen or put nitrogen fertilizer in the soil, and this is representing as up and then down, right? How much movement are we going to see? Nitrogen will see a lot, phosphorus little, and potassium a medium extent, okay? Solution P and P uptake vary over the growing season. That's not surprising. It depends on the buffering capacity of the soil and the crop demand. It depends on how much is leaving versus is getting removed from that solution versus how much is getting supplied. They're just showing 2 sufficient soils. The solid line being sufficient versus the deficient. This is our plant phosphorus uptake rate and days after planting, and we can see that when we've got a sufficient soil, we've got a high enough buffering capacity that it can supply and keep up with that plant demand. For the deficient soil, we don't, and that's by definition it's called deficient. All right, now we're going to talk about this inorganic fraction. Okay, so these boxes over here: adsorbed P, clay and other mineral surfaces, secondary P minerals, and then primary P minerals, okay? So inorganic phosphorus is held by 2 main processes. It's adsorption and desorption reactions, and precipitation and dissolution reactions, and that's what's represented by these arrows here. Desorption and adsorption. So desorption is into solution, adsorption is out of solution. dissolution into solution, and precipitation out of solution. Okay, so these are the two primary mechanisms. Adsorption, desorption are reactions really with clays. Okay, so we think about these with clays, and we can think more about this kind of in terms of exchange sites. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that, that these orthophosphates are negatively charged, and we might say, oh well, these are negative anions, and so they're not going to be sticking to these exchange sites in clays like, say, calcium or potassium would be. And that's true, but when we think about phosphorus, we're often thinking about exchange sites and, holding, being bound to these clay. The interactions of clay and mineral surfaces are a little bit different, and we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so rather than just the overall charge, we're typically going to be binding to broken edges of clay particles, and then iron and aluminum oxides is the primary mechanism, okay, for adsorption and desorption. Then we've got this other piece, which is precipitation and dissolution. And these really are reactions with calcium, iron, aluminum, manganese, some of these, and they actually form precipitate. Precipitates which are moving out of solution and into solution depending on which way that reaction is flowing. These are highly pH dependent, okay? And so when we talk about phosphorus, pH is a main part, and we'll get a little bit more into this, okay? But pH dependency with precipitation and dissolution, and adsorption and desorption reaction, okay? So collectively, those two processes are called P fixation or sometimes P retention, okay? To the extent of inorganic P fixation depends on many, many factors, but pH is a big one, especially when we talk about phosphorus. Okay, so let's get into this a little bit. pH drives, soil pH drives P fixation, and we showed in the very beginning of the class when we're talking about acid and bases that phosphorus is highly pH dependent, and managing soil in an optimal pH zone is about the best thing you can do for phosphorus availability. When pH drops and becomes acidic past 6, we have a lot of reactions that are aluminum and iron oxides. There's other oxides that form too, manganese oxides being one of them, but typically in terms of the majority it's aluminum and iron oxides. And then when pH of a soil turns alkaline, we have a lot of calcium carbonate that forms. Okay, so then we have these calcium phosphates that form, and so again, adsorption, precipitation reactions on both sides. But depending on the pH, the mechanism or the actual reacting elements change from iron and aluminum when they're acidic to calcium primarily when it's basic. So adsorption, desorption reactions occur with clays, okay? Binds to broken edges of clay particles. So we talked about this with, say, CEC in organic matter. These exposed OH groups can often exchange with the H2PO4 reaction. So the clay has negatively bound surfaces, but it's not these negative charges that are actually holding these orthophosphates. It's more like these exposed OH groups is a much larger component of that. And that's why highly weathered soils, i.e. 1-to-1 clays, have a lot more of these OH groups and therefore fix a lot more phosphorus than, say, a 2-to-1 clays. And that's, when we are managing, say, tropical soils or highly weathered soils, we have a lot more concern about if we're fertilizing those soils, is that phosphorus all going to get bound up, or is it going to be available for the plant that we, the crop that we plant in the future, okay? So this idea of adsorption, desorption, it's really this interaction with these OH groups that has a large role of that. In calcareous soil, phosphorus replaces this CO3 minus groups and then forms these calcium carbonate precipitates. Okay, so just to flesh this out with iron aluminum oxide adsorption, what does this actually look like from a chemical structure? Well, here we have these an aluminum oxide, and you add phosphorus, and then you either sorry about that, folks. And you either it's driven by hydrolysis of water, depending on the reaction. But what we have here is this water that's formed, and then we've got this P2O5 that associates with these OH groups, okay? And so this is kind of bound here, but it's not like a really intricate reaction. When it continues and loses water, one of these, say, protons flows off and actually makes water, and then we get this aluminum it goes from this OH association to this bound aluminum oxygen phosphorus. This becomes really fixed and non-labile at this point. So this would be considered labile phosphorus, this non-labile. So the availability decreases when it goes from this reaction to here. Likewise with iron, we've got an iron OH group. We're adding phosphorus, this orthophosphate. There's two of them in this case. And we've got that knocking that H off, that one of these protons off, and it becomes water. And then we've got this P2O that reacts. And so this iron oxide would be considered relatively labile. So this is certainly not comprehensive. It's just an example of how phosphorus will react with these surfaces, these aluminum and iron surfaces, which of course occupy a huge amount of the total clay structure in soil. Okay, and this is kind of an ugly diagram from the Brady and Weil textbook, and it shows kind of the same thing, but maybe it fleshes this out a little bit more. So if you're interested in looking at that to understand this a little bit better, you can. But for the purposes of this class, it's just sufficient to kind of understand this in a very general way what's happening. Right? We don't need to understand the reactions, but we need to understand that they often are interacting with these OH groups on clay surfaces, and that's what's binding them. And sometimes it really binds them and makes them very unavailable, and sometimes it just holds them there for in an intermediate state. Okay, so precipitation and dissolution is another type of reaction. This is typically a more slow process, and when we talk about precipitation, it's really moving that phosphorus oftentimes out of solution and making it not available. Okay. Again, this is the reaction that's highly pH dependent. When it's acidic, we'll get more aluminum and iron phosphates, and when it's more basic, we'll get calcium phosphates that occur. Okay. So phosphorus fixation, again, as the collective process of adsorption and precipitation are controlled by a number of factors in soil, pH being kind of first and foremost, and one of the things that we have a lot of control over. Soil minerals, both the texture, like how much sandstone and clay, and actually what the mineralogy of that clay and the silt might be. Those have important effects. Cation anion effects. Divalent cations enhance phosphorus adsorption relative to monovalent cations, so 2 pluses versus 1 plus. Soil organic matter, greater organic matter increases P availability. So when we have more organic matter, we have greater phosphorus availability in plants, and that's should come as no surprise, right? Temperature and time, P adsorption increases with temperature and time. And then flooding events kind of cause this, when we've got these redox reactions from flooding, the soil is becoming anoxic. Phosphorus availability typically will increase kind of immediately after flooding because iron species are reduced and phosphorus as a result are more available. Okay. Here's just an example to show you about one of these things, phosphorus fixation, more influenced by minerals. So here we have phosphorus added to soil. So there's soil was fertilized versus phosphorus in soil solution, and we can see depending on the soil type, histosols, vertisols, mollisols. These are all would be considered kind of younger soils or high organic matter soils, particularly these two, but mollisols in particular. Also high organic matter versus older soils here. When we add more P availability in these older, more weathered soils is less than in some of these younger soils or soils with high organic matter. And kind of a similar thing, P in soil solution versus P adsorbed. We've got a 70% clay mollisol, so very little absorption from that, adsorption from that mollisol, very little fixation. But when we've got a 70% clay oxisol, there's a lot more adsorption or P fixation that occurs. Okay, and then here we've got this inceptisol, which is like even higher, for example. Okay, to bring this a little bit closer to home and to think about this in terms of adsorption, there's a nice fact sheet from the University of Kentucky that I won't get into too much, but this is soil test phosphorus, which is a measurement of plant availability of phosphorus, or how available soil phosphorus might be. And this is pounds of P2O fertilizer required, pounds of phosphorus fertilizer to increase soil test phosphorus just by 1 part per million. Okay, so what we see, the whole point of this graph is to show that it's data that's close to home that shows that as our phosphorus availability increases, how much phosphorus is required to raise these levels even further is very small, right? So here it's less than 5 pounds to raise it 1 part per million. But when our soil test phosphorus levels really drop down and get really, really low, that's when it takes a crazy amount. Say, it takes 40 pounds of fertilizer just to increase your soil test P 1 part per million with this soil up here. So as soil test levels drop, as our phosphorus levels or phosphorus availability drops, P fixation rates increase non-linearly, right? And that's an important thing from a fertilizer management and a phosphorus management. We need to understand if we're dealing with really low phosphorus soils, we might need apply more phosphorus than we otherwise would to raise those levels because these fixation rates are really high in low testing soils. Hopefully that's clear. Okay, so back to the phosphorus cycle. We just talked about this transformations, this inorganic phase. Let's go into this organic phase. Okay, so we're talking about not all these interactions with the mineral piece, but what's going on with the organic fraction, the biology. Okay, and again, inorganic solution we've covered. Now we're into the organic piece. So organic phosphorus represents about 50% of total soil P, and that's a rough average. Again, it can range anywhere from 15 to 80% organic P, depending on the soil, depending on management, et cetera, et cetera. So similar to nitrogen, organic phosphorus compounds are complex, and there's all kinds of them out there, but most are these kind of esters of orthophosphate. What do we mean by that? Well, an ester group in organic chemistry, right? We're thinking about a single bond and with phosphorus, and then this double bond would be our ester group. And so a lot of phosphorus in the organic fraction. we talk about phytic acid being, an important or highly represented organic phosphorus, but more broadly, those are that phytic acid would be classified into this like inositol phosphates. So maybe up to 50% of total organic P, 10 to 50% would be this inositol phosphates, and phytic acid being one of those. There's also, phospholipids, there's nucleic acids, there's all kinds of things that are out there, but really when we're talking about organic P, how do we classify all this? It's very challenging to do that, but phytic acid represents, typically a pretty large fraction relative to other organic phosphorus-containing compounds. And not surprisingly, as organic matter levels increase, organic phosphorus levels increase. This is true with nitrogen. Again, this is that stoichiometry where, there's typically carbon to nitrogen ratios and there's carbon to phosphorus ratios. As organic matter increases, our phosphorus will increase. Here's showing two different soils, a mollisol versus an alpha sol. This would be a much richer in terms of percent organic matter soil. Mollisols, we have a few of those here in Ohio, but not too many. These are considered more prairie soils, so we get into Illinois and Iowa, and we'd see a lot more of this. Alpha sol would be kind of a more more familiar soil order than we'd have here in Ohio. A lot of alpha sols here, and showing that those drop off pretty quickly. The organic P does with the organic carbon content, so those are highly related. Here is the graph just showing organic carbon versus organic P, and then over depth. Okay. Similar to nitrogen, we talk about mineralization and immobilization reactions with phosphorus, organic phosphorus. So this is primarily catalyzed by phosphatase enzymes. And phosphatase enzymes are produced both by plants, they're produced by fungi, they're produced by bacteria, a lot of different things that are making enzymes that free up phosphorus as an essential nutrient, right? So again, this idea of going from an organic to an inorganic P source is mineralization, and the opposite reaction of would be immobilization. When it goes from the inorganic to the organic P fraction, then it's an immobilization event, right? Quantity of P mineralized in soils increases with increasing organic P content. So not just, when organic matter increases, organic P increases, and when organic P increases, our total P mineralized from that organic source increases as well. Okay, so that makes sense, right? That's again kind of like just how big is that organic P pool and how fast is it turning over? We're going to get mineralization from that. So building organic matter, building organic matter in general will typically build organic phosphorus, and as organic phosphorus builds, we're going to have more phosphorus availability. Carbon to phosphorus ratios. Again, we talked about a 20-to-1 for nitrogen. Mineralization, we don't have this maybe particularly that super clean cutoff, but say 200-to-1, we can pretty much guarantee mineralization will occur. So 200 carbons for every 1 phosphorus, and immobilization when it's greater than 300-to-1. So this 200-to-1 and 300-to-1 are kind of, this our level, really kind of a rule of thumb. Of course, not always the case. It depends on the soil and the material, And somewhere between, 200 to 301, there might not be any net gain or loss. It might just be, say, some kind of no-sum game in terms of mineralization versus immobilization. Cultivation increases organic P mineralization and decreases soil organic P. You could say the same thing with nitrogen and the same thing with carbon, right? Here's 3 different soils, native prairie versus 60 to 70 years of cultivation in ag, and then how much carbon or phosphorus is lost. We can see the top line is organic carbon, and 32%, 37, and 46, and then this organic P, 18, 17, and 29. So as we continue to disturb soils, we typically are going to lose our organic P as a result. All right. Mineralization from phosphorus is a biologically driven process. All the same things that influenced nitrogen mineralization are going to influence phosphorus. pH, acidic soils are going to have slower mineralization, temperature, moisture, aeration, all these things, things that drive kind of life. And just think of decomposition. These should be intuitive in terms of like the higher temperatures and moistures we're going to be driving mineralization processes higher, right? Okay, so that's the phosphorus cycle. This was kind of a long one, but I just wanted to kind of put everything together. Again, we've got additions, transformations, and losses. And we're going to move on for the next lecture talking about really some of these additions for fertilizer sources, and then we'll move on into phosphorus management.